Everyone to the final webinar of the 21-22 season. And we have with us today Maria Rucsandra Stan, who's going to talk to us about research assessment and evaluation. But before I introduce Maria, let me simply acknowledge the fact that this is not only seminar number 310 in the history of CG since 2015, but is webinar number 177 on the trot, and the final webinar, which will be presided over by the genius who created our webinar program, Trevor Trihan. Trevor is moving to South Korea and in the month of August, very soon. So he won't be connecting everyone up in the coming academic year, but the system that he's created will be used. And so Trevor will live on in our infrastructure and in our institutional memory. And we're extremely grateful to the wonderful work that he's done. He played a major role in sustaining global higher education conversation, in bringing a range of issues to the higher education community across the world, and bringing a range of people into connection with each other in the manner imagined in geographical space, as a sort of great constellation of individuals working together, exchanging, building things together, and of course with gaps and absences between, as caused with all kinds of relationships. But we've abridged some of those gaps in our process of our webinar program that wouldn't have been bridged without it. So we're really grateful to Trevor for making that possible. Now, today's topic, insights into evaluation of research quality, what role for the researcher? And that with the topic is led by Maria Rucsandra Stan, who's a PhD candidate at Carlo Cattaneo University in Italy, and who's been working at the University of Oxford as part of the Centre for Global Higher Education project on research, the research function and mission of higher education. And her interest is very much coincides with the interest in that project. Her research interest focus is on the effects of the evaluation system on knowledge production and researchers in academia and research institutions. So it's all about evaluation, how that plays out in people's work, and the kind of knowledge they engage with and develop with each other. So Maria, you'll tell us about that. Let me just give everyone the housekeeping rules before we start. Remember, the webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CG website, usually happens within 24 hours. And a transcript of the chat function will be posted as well. When you go to the CG website posting, that takes you into our YouTube channel, and you'll find the previous 176 webinars plus 2 annual conferences are there. Now, during the webinar, no need to have your video on, and please keep yourself muted. That's most important. But when we get to the Q&A stage and we ask you to come into the discussion, of course, you turn both of them on at that point. We recommend using speaker view in the top right-hand corner there, so you can more clearly see who is talking at any given moment. Now, to ask a question, use the chat and write out the question you want to ask. If you want to make a statement rather than being Socratic and asking a question, you're also free to do that. At the end of Maria's presentation, I'll then select from what's coming forward in the chat for participation in the Q&A. Now, normally I'm able to send you a private message in the chat, just telling you that we're about to call you in to give you a warning. When you are called in to make your statement or ask your question, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and then state your name and where you are from. And let me just give you the quick reminder that the earlier you come into the chat, the more likely you are to get into the Q&A. If you come in towards the end of the discussion, you may miss out because the speaking list will be full. At this point, Maria, the screen is all yours.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you also for the lovely introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I guess I've already been presented. Maybe I could just add that similarly to the project that I've been collaborating with here at Oxford, I'm also part of a project back in my university in Italy that is a project of national interest that also deal with the effects of evaluation. So that is how I came to fall in love with this research topic. I'm now going to share my screen, so please let me know if you can see the slides.
We can see that, Maria. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so without further introduction into the title, let's see what we're going to be talking about today. So my aim is that of bringing awareness on the role and responsibilities that we as researchers have in the research evaluation system. In my dissertation, which this is a work in progress, I look at 3 different roles. However, in this presentation, we're mainly going to look at the reflective role. So we're going to see the researcher as part of a scholarly community and as the active role, where we're going to see the researcher that holds also the role of an editor. So they're an active actor in legitimizing the quality of research in the machinery of evaluation. And finally, I'm going to try to summarize in some way what we know so far, what we're missing, and what we should be looking for when defining the one of the emerging definitions of quality. So some context on research evaluation. We all know that academic research is important for the development of a country, and that is why numerous countries have implemented research evaluation system in order to balance the relationship between research and public goals. That is why this need of the government and agency to monitor and assess the scientific research by university or research system has led to a system based on rankings, also due to the nature that these bibliometric indicators have. Now, the original aim of these bibliometric indicators was that of being complementary to the peer assessment. However, they have taken the spotlight in defining both the quality and the impact of research. However, we need to take into account that these indicators are not able to immediately give us an evaluation of the quality of research. So in terms of theoretical framework, as I've just mentioned, we're going to look at 2 roles. And the first one is the reflective role of the researcher in the evaluation system. So the reflective practitioner is based on the literature of methodology of reflective practice. And some definitions go back to 1953 by Corey, who states that it is a process in which practitioners study problems scientifically, to which Hopkins and Ebbets add that it is a form of disciplinary research whose goal is to understand, advance, and reform the practice, in this case, of research evaluation. So what we have is that the development of the practitioner is a result of the interaction between them as a researcher and their environment in the research evaluation. We're also going to look at another role, which is the active role in terms of being an editor. So what happens is that the 2 roles need to be distinguished. On the one side, we have the researcher that acts as part of a scholarly community where they have their own epistemic and ontological assumptions. On the other hand, we have that they might hold the role of the editor. And in that case, they're responsible for defining the worth, the merit, the value of a manuscript of a piece of work. Now, the evaluation of research, defined by Powell, is a type of study that uses standard social research methods for evaluative purposes. And what happens is that since researchers can hold both roles, the lines between the 2 roles can sometimes be blurred out. So what happens is that we have inherent in the role of evaluation are both the values that we hold as researchers and as evaluators that in the end influence and define what we mean by quality of research. The third role, which is not going to be discussed today as it's not part of the presentation, is a passive role. And I'm just quickly going to let you know is the role in which us as researchers are how we are influenced in our research practices, in our research strategies by the epistemic assumptions of the research evaluation system, which are then again used as information to be transferred to the reflective role. And then once again, the loop continues. So all 3 roles are more or less in a loop of transferring information from one to another. So let's start with the first role. The results of this presentation at least in the reflective role, are based on a paper that is currently under review, and it's a systematic literature network analysis. Now, this type of methodology, what helps you do is to systemize the literature in an objective way, because it's the network of authors itself that systemizes themselves into clusters. So we try to trace the different contributions of the disciplines that have contributed to the research evaluation literature. In particular, we were interested to see how they dealt with the concepts of quality and impact of research. Here you can see just in the middle of the slide, the research string that we used, and we had as a final output 284 documents, which you can see here in the middle of the slide. The blue dots there, the connected network, are the 284 documents. PIEC, which is the software that we use, identified two connected components, which we will see subsequently are the two different disciplines that have conducted the discourses on research evaluation. In terms of preliminary findings, we also wanted to add the fact that it's interesting to see how this topic has become more of interest starting from 2010. And also in terms of keywords distribution, it already gives us an insight of what we can find in our database. If you look, the percentage for the keyword of impact is higher than the keyword for quality. This result is further reinforced if we look at the top publishing journals. As we can see, Scientometrics and Journals of Infometrics are at the top of the list of where our studies from the database have been published. So it gives us an insight of what exactly are we going to find more of in terms of discipline. So the first results is the first cluster of that we saw before, and it represents the first discipline. In order to identify the communities within this cluster, we've used the community analysis by PIEC. And what we found is that there are 5 communities to which we've read the papers in order to assign to them a different team correspondingly. All themes are discourses led by infometricians. In fact, the topics are focusing on quantitative indicators, how they are elaborated and how they should be used, and as well as they focus on concepts such as productivity and quality. But in this case, quality and impact of research frequently seem to be either interchangeable or overlapping. Another interesting point in these 5 communities is that community number 3, the green one, and community number 4, the yellow one, are focusing on the Italian context. And this is due to the specialization of a group of Italian researchers that have created their own network and specialized themselves in the issues of the Italian research evaluation context. So what I've tried to do here is for each of the 5 communities to identify a definition for quality, one for impact, and to highlight the emerging discourses that they're trying to bring awareness to the other researchers of their community. So for example, in the first one that deals with the scope of metrics, the definition of impact is of course that of the societal impact, because metrics are or should be able to measure the societal impact of research. So the aim of this community is that to provide an integrative evaluation of research by complementing the already existing methods such as peer review and quantitative indicators. In the second community, we can see that we have attempts in overcoming the biases of bibliometric indicators. So in terms of definition of quality, what I've tried to extract is that the quality is defined as the impact of a publication on a field, and that it can be also measured through citation networks. Now, if we look at the definition of impact, it has been identified as the contribution to the advancement of knowledge. What I've tried to highlight here is the fact that it's quite interesting to see how in defining quality, the word impact is used. So there's not a clear distinction between the two. The third and the fourth one, as I said, deals with the Italian community. And in particular, the fourth one is interesting that even though they do not provide a definition for quality or impact, it brings awareness to something that is very important in Italy, and that is that we have two sets of disciplines. We have one that are those disciplines that are bibliometric, and therefore the use of bibliometric indicators favor them during the research evaluation process. And then we have the non-bibliometrical one, where in this case, bibliometric indicators actually do not favor them. So it's interesting to see that this community tries to bring awareness on this. The last one, which is on the role of the journal impact factor, it takes this critical stand in criticizing that the journal impact factor might be a proxy for quality, especially because this means that the researcher's work would only be considered of quality in the case that they managed to publish on mainstream journals. This, furthermore, leads to the homologation of all research to respect the standardized concept of research quality that emerges through this definition. Moving along, the second component, again, by using the community analysis, we've identified two communities which are part of the social sciences. And in this case, the topics are the effects of quantitative indicators on research practices and strategies. But the most interesting thing is that the more complex definition that they give of quality. In fact, they define the concept of quality as being multidimensional. And if before with the infometrics, we saw that the concept of impact and quality were overlapping, in this case, impact is actually a dimension of quality. So they're criticizing the system which we have in place that is dominated by indicators and that are not able to capture the whole multidimensionality that quality of research is actually in reality. So the two communities do agree on the multidimensionality of the concept of quality. And the first one also adds that even though we use the same quantitative indicators in research evaluation, each epistemic field has their own approach in defining quality. So what is the value add of this community is the fact that we should be contextualizing the way we consider the definition of quality. On the other side, the second community brings value in terms of focusing on the societal impact that research has. In fact, they try to bring awareness on the fact that there's a lack of focus as well as a lack of tools that can be implemented to grasp the societal impact and benefits that research has for society. Finally, I tried to systemize and to show how there's not a clear definition of the 5 concepts that you can see here in the table. If some of them, for example, the statement that research quality is measured through peer review, everyone agrees on that. There seems to be some scholars that do not agree on the fact that maybe not just scholarly impact of societal impact and productivity are measured by bibliometric indicators, but some also say that research quality can be measured by bibliometric indicators. Interesting as well is the fact that some scholars, as we've seen before, state that research quality is a multidimensional concept. However, some scholars also agree that scholarly impact is also a multidimensional concept. So the point of this table is that to show how we're still in the progress of understanding and defining the concepts, the characteristics of each one of these concepts. So the key takeaways that you should remember from this part is the fact that there is a need to increase the awareness and acknowledge that we as researchers have our own roles, responsibilities, and limits of our discipline in which we're contributing to the research evaluation studies as well as the research assessment process. And we should also be aware of the fact that there's no a priori status of one discipline over another. So the two connected components, the infometrics and the social sciences that we've seen before that have emerged from the literature review should be working together in order to contribute to the research assessment. On one side, infometricians should clearly state that the approach they have is more technical, whereas social sciences should have more space in contributing to the development of methods for evaluation and in defining a framework for evaluation. So now that we've seen one role, let's see actually how we as researchers can not only reflect upon what we're doing, but we actually have an active part in the machinery of evaluation. So in this case, we're looking at the role of the editor. More precisely, we're looking at those editors that are actively editing the choices of publishing or not a manuscript. So we've decided to look at four main phases of the peer review where the editor is active. One is the desk rejection, the reviewer's selection, the reviewer's report intervention or rejection, and the final editorial decision, which is the summary of the previous phases. Now, in order to do this, we see the editor, of course, as the gatekeeper of scientific knowledge. And this is because they are able to shape the future of a discipline and therefore ultimately also the scholarly communication. Of course, they're responsible for numerous activities, not just the peer review process, but also the strategic direction of the journal, as well as defining the ethical standards of the journal. So in order to understand what are the underlying assumptions to understand how the editor legitimizes the quality of a manuscript, we've used the institutional perspective logic. Since some logics provide a basis for action, while others provide the competitive cognitive frames for a subset of participants. Moreover, we recognize the fact that organizations can actually experience multiple logics that influence both the individual and the organizational behavior. And in the end, we also assume the fact that some logics might be dominating with respect to the others, depending on the context in which they operate. So let's look at the dimensions of institutional logics in the academic peer review that we thought are worthwhile testing. The dimensions were, of course, derived from the work of Thornton and Ocasio from 2012. And the first logic is the academic one, which basically focuses on the advancement of scholarly knowledge. That is its scope. The second one, the market one, focuses more on the external performance of indicators. The third one, the bureaucratic one, which is derived from the state logic of Thornton, bases on respecting the guidelines, the policies, and the standards of the journal. And finally, the professional logic, which in this case is closely related to the academic logic, but is not the same, because as we said in the beginning, in the role of the editor, the professional logic is the one that represents the values and the assumptions of his role as an editor, whereas the academic logic is focused on the epistemological and ontological assumption of his community. And in order for him to hold this role, he needs to distinguish the two logics. So how do we test these logics? Well, as if you remember, I told you that in Italy, we have the non-bibliometric disciplines and the bibliometric disciplines. So we took one from each side. In this case, translated at an international level, we took as a non-bibliometric discipline, the organizational studies, whereas for the bibliometric side, we took the orthopaedics and sports medicines, and we took the journals that have been ranked as relevant by the Italian National Agency for Research Evaluation. We've sent over 1,500 surveys, which were first piloted through 6 cognitive interviews to editors from our samples that were willing to participate to these interviews, and to which we're still grateful, very much grateful today. The online survey was designed on an 8-point Likert scale, rating from 1 to 7 the characteristics of the manuscript, either content, ethical, or technical aspect, as well as the reviewer's characteristics. And the 8th point was the point where it was mentioned that they don't have an opinion on this, they don't care, and they don't want to respond in any way. The items were derived from the literature, from previous surveys conducted also with editors on the same topic, and those that have emerged from the cognitive interviews. We had 122 complete survey responses, which is very much in line with the response rate that I've seen from other previous studies, and to which we performed qualitative analysis and an exploratory factor analysis. So some preliminary results, we saw that some journals adopt more than one type of peer review. And where in the orthopaedics and sports medicine, there is a preference for the single blind. In organizational studies, they prefer the double blind peer review to be more common. It's also interesting to see how there are more female editors in organizational studies than in orthopedics and sports medicine. However, both disciplines dedicate more or less the same time to their editorial decisions, so less than 50% of their time. We've also asked our editors what they think are the most difficult challenges in the peer review. And in line with the literature, they stated how finding reviewers is the most difficult task. And in particular, the editors in orthopedics and sports medicine confirmed that this is much harder for them, as they did in our cognitive interviews. Lastly, they also told us that the lack of response from reviewers and English language are also some issues that they face during the peer review process. We then asked them what they think there are some improvements to the scholarly practice, and both editors on both sides of the disciplines agreed that making publications open access is something that could improve the scholarly practice. However, the organizational studies editor did not agree very much on open interaction and open identity. So they were not too keen on practicing these scholarly practices. However, throughout the whole, all 5 items, we saw that the orthopedics and sports medicine editors would be more willing on average to accept the scholarly practice of open scholarly practice. In terms of institutional logics, the items that have loaded into our factors are 4 for the market, 4 for the professional, 3 for the bureaucratic, and 4 for the academic. However, only the market and the professional one have acceptable values. It's also interesting to look that the organizational study editors scored on average higher on the items of the market logic with respect to their colleagues in orthopedics and sports medicine. However, both disciplines scored similarly on the professional logic. We've also looked at the factors that influence the decisions that the editor takes on the reviewer's report. So the only 2 factors that actually influence the decisions they take on the report of the reviewer is the content itself, and then the perception that the editor has of the relationship with the reviewer. The other 2 factors had values of comeback alpha below accepted values. So it's interesting to note how the editors of orthopedics tend to reject the reviewer's report mostly for 2 reasons. One, if they have a strong subjective perspective on the manuscript, and if there are contradicting points with the previous reviews. And this is less common in the case of organizational studies editors. Now, what should we take away from this? Well, the fact that the emerging definition of quality is based on the 2 dominating logic, the market and the professional one, which are the basis for action, meaning that they are the logics that lead the whole peer review process. We then saw that the bureaucratic and the academic provided competitive cognitive frames, meaning that the comeback alpha were not an acceptable value. I've listed here the items which have loaded into our factor analysis, and these are the items that, at least for our sample, if they describe your manuscript, then they have a higher chance to be published. One of the most interesting, however, findings in this research is the fact that the editors in our samples are actually aware of the dual role they hold. And this is because we saw that the professional logic is one of the 2 dominating logic, whereas the academic one had a low comeback alpha value, and therefore it didn't impact on its professional logic. So what are the implications? Well, by having a dominating market logic, it means that there's a preference for those articles that can increase the performance of the journal. And this is maintained and aided by the professional logic that helps to maintain the performance standards of the journal. Therefore, the emerging definition in the sample that we selected focuses on maintaining the performance-based evaluation mechanism that we already have in place. And this is important to understand because it impacts our career as researcher at any stage, and it influences our publication strategies as well as the discourses that define our scholarly communication. So what I've tried so far to bring out of this presentation is the awareness of the roles that we have as researcher. On the one side, we have our reflective role in which we need to understand our roles, our responsibilities, and the limits that our discipline has in contributing to the literature on research evaluation and on the framework for research assessment. We have to understand the complexity of this topic and understand that there's just not one side of research evaluation, but there are many sides, and that we need to work collaboratively to improve not only the measurements of performance, but also identify the effects that these have. On the other side, we've looked at the editor's role. So when we are not just researchers, but we are also an evaluator. And that is where we need to understand the distinction between our role as a researcher and our role as an editor. Moreover, we need to understand as an editor that we need to balance between the organizational performance of our journal, as well as the advancement of knowledge of our epistemic community. And finally, editors should be aware that the final editorial decisions are impactful, not just for the scholarly communication, but for the future of our disciplines and the methods of evaluation for the manuscript. So in the end, what we know so far about the emerging definition of quality, what we're missing, and what we should be looking at. Well, first, we need to contextualize the assumptions that lead to the various definitions of quality. We've seen in the beginning that quality can take on different definitions based on the researcher's epistemic community. And therefore, if some authors perceive it as a multidimensional concept, others do not differentiate, as we've seen, between quality and impact of research. So while some clearly state that it's measured by the peer review, some others agree that it also can be measured by quantitative indicators. So the overlapping of these concepts is due to the diversity of the epistemic communities that we are all part of. So again, we need to understand what is our role as a researchers, our responsibility and our limits, and how we can contribute in order to reach a common framework. And finally, we need to balance the underlying assumptions that legitimize the quality of the published work. So we've seen that the current logics are quite coherent with the performance-based evaluation system that we have. This means that there's an homologation of all research to respect the standardized concept of research quality defined by the market and the professional logics. So therefore, there is little space for soul-touching research as the current logics aim to reach a certain performance objective. And to conclude, we need to develop a framework that can capture the multidimensionality of quality, catering for the epistemic needs of all disciplines. Thank you. Let me just stop sharing my screen now.
Yes, you do, and that was really good. Thank you, Maria. That was a really great presentation and really clear and very strong conceptually. And I mean, I will start the discussion myself if I can. I mean, what we're talking about here is modes of reflexivity and their influence on behavior. You know, there's different templates and sets of criteria, and what really matters is how they shape knowledge, and you know what happens between the engagement in these social processes which constitute forms of evaluation and the mind of the researcher, and then what they do. I mean, I think you've identified the multiple logics really well. I mean, this is a really good project. But I think there's a mode of reflexivity that's left right outside that's very germane, very influential. It's left right outside the framework, not only that you're using, but our evaluation systems use. I mean, the questions I ask myself as a scholar, you know, when I try to write original papers, you know, new papers each time, and hopefully conceptually new papers as well as empirically informed papers. Try and do something, not repeat myself, but try and do something different. And I think others are like me, but not everyone is like me. Right? Well, the question I ask myself is, I have kind of two prior questions, two prior forms of reflexivity that I used, which you didn't discuss. First question is, what is true? The second question is, what is intellectually significant? Not quite the same question, but clearly likely to be related in a complicated way. The third question is, what is quality? And then we get into the multiple logics that you've identified as what is quality. And that's a really useful discussion. I think the what is true and what is intellectually significant questions we answer individually, and we answer in small groups amongst people they're not necessarily co-thinkers, but they're quite closely related to our work, and we learn from a lot, and we cooperate with a lot, and so on. So, and this is not the peer review process. Peer review process is usually at a high level of generality in a discipline. And I'm very experienced in it because I contribute maybe 6 or 8 papers a year and run into all kinds of rocks and problems with all my innovative papers. They all get rejected or heavily attacked, and I have to shop them around until I get them published, and then they do well, because they're innovative. And I also see peer review playing out a lot as a journal editor, which I've been a journal editor for 10 years. And my sense is that peer review operates at some remove from the intellectual processes most of the time. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's close to the action, if you like, intellectually, but mostly it's operating at a high level of generality. And it's using some of these metrics or definitions of quality which you're drawing on. Now, the problem with this is the form of reflexivity which we develop as individual researchers or in our small communities that are about what is true and what is intellectually significant. There's no universal or singular answers. There's no general answer. It's a huge multiplicity of answers, and you can't capture that in any of these quality systems. But if we stop thinking what is true and what is intellectually significant, and we only think in terms of these metrics and these systems of evaluation, the work we do will not be as good. As a researcher, my career began when performance systems began, about the same time, 90s in Australia, early 90s. We were early in the process of new public management reform. And I sort of told myself, this is going to be very influential, this stuff, this list of criteria that you've got to fulfill and so on. And even just, the quantity drivers in publication records and those sorts of things. This is going to be very influential. So I've got to remember to motivate myself according to what I think is true and what I think is significant, and try and fulfill the needs of these systems, but really fulfill my own agenda, and those aren't always going to be the same. And if I allow these systems to take over, my work won't be as good. And I thought that has guided me well, that notion of a double process, and one that you've got to safeguard and protect the core process, which is the intellectual one. So what do we do about that? What do we do about the fact that these multiple systems of reflexivity are likely to drive us away from some of the most important things we should be doing?
You got the right points, Simon. Those are amazing points. Thank you so much. It's actually a question of, we need to be more aware of what is actually happening, because as you said, we are, I don't want to use the word victims, but we are dragged along the various evaluation system practices that we have in place. So what happens is that sometimes we're not aware of the effects that these have on our research practices, which I think is the most important thing. The fact that by understanding the effects that we have on our research practices, we understand if the way that we're being evaluated is actually useful for our research. And as you said, there's no one single emerging definition of quality. It is a contextualized emerging definition of quality for each discipline, based on our ontological and epistemological assumptions, based on norms and rules that are not written, but they are they define those disciplines, even in terms of productivity. Some disciplines are more productive than others. So we have to take into account that quality in the end and what is useful for one discipline might not be useful for another. So thank you for those great points. They're going to be very fruitful for because the framework that I currently showed you in the beginning of the presentation is still work in progress, and it's the framework that I'm developing for my thesis. So thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Our first question from the main participants is coming from Adriana Gaza Ortiz. So come in, Adriana.
Thank you very much. Very nice talk. Congratulations. I wanted to know, there is a high pressure for quality researchers in the research and in the publication of the projects performed by researchers. So how do you think the emergence of predatory journals and bad quality papers is going to grow in the future? And how to reduce such practices that appears to be evolving in a very intense way? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liana, for your question. And I think that how to reduce such practices, I think by talking about it, by bringing awareness, by being aware of what is actually happening. I don't think they're quite some identified solutions that you can immediately come up with, but I think it's talking about it, being aware about it, of what's happening and how it impacts your practices as a researcher. I don't know if that answered your question.
Thank you, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. Now next, Leandro Rodriguez Medina. So.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Maria. Congratulations. I just want to share a very short experience. A few years ago in my university, we discussed evaluation criteria. We have 5 schools. And not surprisingly, people from engineering and the sciences didn't accept the kind of multidimensional evaluation that in the social sciences we were looking for. We couldn't think even if the social sciences as a single thing, anthropology and psychology and economics and they were very clear. I mean, the science, mathematics, physics, in terms of journals, high impact journals, and so on, the classic perspective. So I was wondering whether first, if this is similar in other regions, and the other is whether you identify some strategies to increase the range of options that people in the science are ready to accept in these discussions for a multidimensional assessment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leandro. Very nice to see you. In Italy, it's similar. As I said before, we have the bibliometric and the non-bibliometric disciplines. So for the non-bibliometrical one, we're quite struggling to be evaluated with the various indicators that are not catering for our needs. They're not able to capture the value of our research, whereas in engineering, and I also have engineers here in my university with whom I work with, they're always like, oh, I'm going to publish. I need those citations. Look at the impact factor. I'm like, okay, but I want to know what is the societal impact. What's the impact, or how do you measure the quality of your work? And they're like, oh, look at the indicators. So I think, as I've mentioned in the last slide, we cannot have a common framework for all disciplines. We need to understand the context in which each discipline has their roots. It was never about a common framework, in my opinion. It's about catering for the needs that we have and accepting that we do research in different paradigms, and each paradigm is true to each epistemic community. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leandro, and thank you, Maria. Penny Walsh is next, and she's going to take us into publishing. Hello, Penny. There she
Yeah,
is.
sorry to be slow. Absolutely fascinating presentation, and I'm really looking forward to reading it when it's published. There's just one dimension. I've been an editor of a learning and teaching journal for, oh gosh, it's 19 years now, and it's in the social sciences. And I'm very conscious of the responsible role of the editors. One dimension that I didn't pick up in your responses was that for me and for Sue Wright, my co-editor, it's really important that what we publish is geared towards the readers, that they're going to get something useful, something interesting, something that, you know, expands their understanding of various issues. And I'm afraid that part of academics, they don't sort of automatically write for the reader. They write for their peers. They write for the peer reviewers. Sometimes it's a bit like they've been very good students and they write for the examiners. So I just wondered if you've got any views on that issue.
Thank you so much, Penny, for your question and comments. So maybe we've identified the 4 logics and the ones that we wanted to test. We then understood also that, of course, there's a lot of work on doing this kind of research, which is one of the first, if I'm not wrong, in institutional logics to identify the institutional logics of the peer review. We've also received comments that we might be missing something called the community logic. So how the editor gives back to the community that they have. There were some items that I did include in my survey, and they will be attached in the appendix of the presentation, and you can have a look at, that try to cover a bit the community logic. However, those items did not load on the factors that we've identified. So it's just that the statistical analysis gave back that only 2 logics are dominating. Of course, these results are, of course, limited to our sample and to the number of responses that we got. It is not something to be generalized. That is why we need to do further investigations on the logics. In fact, one of my next projects is actually to interview editors and understand what are the actual logics that I've missed in my survey. Thank you.
Oh. Our next question might be from Xin Shu, I think. Xin, are you there?
Yes. Hello, sorry, I'm not in a position to type easily or turn on my camera. I'm sorry, but thank you so much for the really excellent presentation. My question is that among the multiple definitions of quality and impact, I wonder if you've observed any trends or development over time of them, particularly if there are relevance or correspondence with the discussions about responsible uses of metrics or open sciences, societal impact. So I wonder, because you've discussed the trends of publication numbers in general over time, but I wonder if there are different directions that are traveling over time as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Xin. Thank you so much for also being here and for your questions and comments. Wow, that's certainly a value added that I did not think about, to actually systematically identify what is the time frame in which these definitions of quality and impact and how they evolve through time. That is something that I should reflect upon and should definitely add to my research. Thank you. That's very important.
Thanks, Sheila. Thanks, Maria. James Robson, I think, has a question too.
Thanks, Rucsandra. What a fantastic presentation. It's so rich, and I think applying these logics is a really useful way into thinking about both quality and knowledge production. So I look forward to reading the paper and seeing how the work develops as well in your thesis. Brilliant. My question is really about the publishing industry itself. Given the huge proliferation of journals, there's a journal for any kind of subfield that you could possibly think of, and many that you can't. I wonder if we risk, when talking about disciplinary boundaries, reifying the role of journal editors in curating boundaries, and actually, they're perhaps not as important as we might think. If somebody can't publish in a particular journal, as Simon highlighted, they just shop the paper around and find somewhere that will publish it. So I wonder, as a field of researchers, it's very easy to think about our roles as editors and peer reviewers in shaping the disciplines that we work in. But is it that that powerful a role that we have to disciplines sort of actually blur and shape and emerge and are much more fluid than that?
Thank you, James, for the comment and questions. Well, it's an interesting thing that I found out is that not all editors are actively editing. So the questionnaire refers more to the editors that have the active role of editing, of choosing the manuscripts that are published and so on, and therefore they define the actual quality. I also found out that in some cases, they're the reviewers. So it also depends on the type of journal that we're talking about. However, this is not generally, I haven't seen this disclosed on many journals. So we don't ever know if it's the editor that is taking the final decision or the reviewers themselves, and the editor just, it's a means of communication between the author and the reviewer, but in the end, they don't make any real action. So I think that's also something interesting that maybe journals should disclose. Who are the people that are deciding on our manuscript? Is it the editor? Are the reviewers? Are they both? So I think it's just a question of who's actually actively editing, whether it's the editor or it's the reviewers themselves. Thanks. Yeah,
my sense is that there's less active editing going on with the massification of the massive volume of papers coming in, and editors are operating more like administrators of paper flows and doing less close reading of manuscripts themselves, and are leaving and are delegating those decisions to reviewers. If reviewers come in with a double reject, then the editor won't even look at the paper. And often, well, not often, sometimes a double rejected paper is a very good paper, but it's just off the air, it's interesting, but edgy, it's been rejected because it's not orthodox. This is happening a lot because reviewers are overloaded. I've got, 10 reviews waiting for me to complete as soon as summer starts. And I think a lot of people get those enormous, flow of review requests, and you have to say yes to some of them. So I think we're all in that kind of speed up situation, which is preventing the kind of close reasoned scrutiny of papers by either editors or reviewers, but reviewers are often substituting for editors. A quick question about your work, Maria. Where's it going next? This is clearly your doctoral work, I gather. When do you finish? And what will you do? What would you like to work on next if you had the power of choice?
Well, the next step, as you've seen in the framework, there's still the third role, which I have not dealt with in this presentation, and it's the passive one, where we actually see how the epistemic assumptions of the research evaluation affect the way we produce knowledge and the way we transfer it. So yeah. That's the biggest project, which is going to, I started now that I got back in Italy, and I'm eager to move along. It is a qualitative studies made out of interviews with researchers in a medical research center. So I think that's the first maybe discipline where you can actually prove the effects of the evaluation practices on our research practices and how it in the end affects the health of the patient. So you have a more immediate impact for medicine rather through social sciences. So that's something very dear to me. And probably the ultimate scope of my dissertation is that of bringing awareness of what we're dealing with. I think it's important to be aware of the system that we are in, even not only as early research careers, but also maybe on those that are more in their advanced state of their career and they're already more adapted to the process itself. I think there's always room for improvement, and before actually bringing on improvements, because I've noticed, for example, infometricians tend to improve their indicators each time after every research assessment exercise. However, maybe we should start improving the methods for evaluation based on the effects that we see on our research practices. Let's try to understand more what we're doing before improving what we already have. So.
It sounds pretty good to me, but it takes you in all different directions, doesn't it? This kind of close-up, scrutiny of medical research and the epistemic assumptions. It's a very different kind of research and knowledge-building exercise to looking at the way in which the relationship between outputs and impact and indicators and metrics and measures is playing out. Where is this kind of work being done around the world? The sort of work you're engaged in and you were doing at Oxford with the team there, where else is it happening?
Well, actually, that's one thing that I'm currently searching. Due to the COVID pandemic, it was quite hard to actually go to conference, build your network. So I felt a bit, let's say a bit isolated. So that's why I was so happy when I found actually one of the webinars. Actually, I participated, I think, to the last year's conference, and that's how I learned about the project, on which in the end I've also participated, and it was an amazing experience. But now I'm trying to potentially increase my network and see who other people are out there that are intrigued by this. In terms of the epistemic communities and the effects of research evaluation on the practices of researchers, I know there is a small community in Holland, but I don't want to butcher her name, but it is somebody that I hope to meet someday, and it's Sarah Derishke. She actually deals with this, and she is in my results. That's how I got to know her work, and she deals with topics similarly to mine. So hopefully one day.
Now you've highlighted the importance of disciplinary differences, and of course, in some cases, we're looking at the subdisciplinary differences as well. I mean, you've highlighted the importance of that, and that's really important. And I think all of us understand that point too. Do you think national comparisons tell us much? National system comparisons?
Sorry, Simon, I think I didn't.
Do you think, you've highlighted the importance of disciplinary comparisons and differences. What about national system comparisons and differences? What do they tell us much, do you think?
Yes, I think they do. I've actually had the opportunity to see the differences in the project here at Oxford, that there are differences at a national level between how the different research evaluation system, career structures are different. And again, it's a question of doing comparative work to understand where it works better. But again, I think it's a matter of context and of culture, and what works best for a country might not work best for, but good for another one.
Yep. And well, you could make the same point about institutions too, and their different roles and their different, I won't say different places in a hierarchy, that's kind of boring discussion, but it does play out a bit. But you know, the differences between, you know, research institutes and government labs and universities that with one or another mission and so on are also interesting. But we don't have easy means of differentiating between those kinds of cases. But I suspect, you know, particularly when you're looking at things like impact, you know, that those differences can be quite important and they can be understood in categories. We've got a couple more questions coming in late, and I'll bring in just a minute. I'll just get the question up for myself. Bita Boraska Besta. Brita, I hope I got that right, and please ask your question.
Hello.
Oh, we got Rebecca. I was actually looking for Beta.
Thank you for.
Beta was ahead of you, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Rebecca, you have to wait.
Okay.
Come from
For voice,
Rebecca,
hear
I'm
me?
sorry, but
Yes.
Rebecca, can you withdraw? Beta is next. You're after Beta.
Okay. Okay. So I had a question because your presentation was excellent. However, there was some phrase, some symbol I really considered not quite proper for this presentation. So I'm curious, what do you really mean by the symbol precising emerging definitions of quality? What do you mean by soul touching research? Would you specify, would you precise, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Beata, for your questions and your comments. Okay, I think I can see why it's not coherent in your vision. However, when I refer to soul touching research, it's actually a term that I did took from one of the authors that I've identified from the literature that actually expressed the same thought. And by soul touching research, it means that it's not that type of research that tries to follow the standards of the quality that is dictated by the indicators and by the journal impact factor. So it tries to bring value to society rather than just to the performance indicators. I don't know if that could answer your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Beta. And can we bring in Rebecca now? I'm sorry to hold you up, Rebecca. Please ask your question.
Yes, sorry, I heard that before it's me, and I'm really impressed by your great presentation. And I was wondering, because you have mentioned that between the peer review and editor, their relationship is subtle. And I just want to ask you if you have imagined before the ideal relationship between them, and also the relationship between the author and the maybe the public. And if the imagine about the ideal relationship will be benefit for your suggestion, I wonder. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think the ideal relationship between the three roles, so the editor, the reviewer, and the author, is actually already depicted by the concept of open interaction. So where both the authors, the reviewers, and the editors talk and speak freely about the manuscript that they have to evaluate. And I think this is an important approach because it has also the concept of taking responsibility of you as an evaluator, of how you evaluate that research. So it's not just about being disclosing your identity, but it's taking responsibility, accountability for the way you evaluate that research. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thanks very much. And I think it's good. And I also have another question, because when you be an editor, you have to balance between the society's respond, and also you want to be like the Beta said, the soul touching, soothing research. So I think how to balance between this, because each object has this its own merit and its own questions. Because if I am an author, I want my papers to be published as soon as possible, and for the audience, they want to know maybe the more detailed or the thing that reflect to their fields, and also for the the journal and the public, they have their own consequence, their own worries. So how to balance between the different obstacle, different angles? I mean, I think it's a very difficult thing. And if there's maybe it is need to be to figure out a way or to model to better make them to better cooperate with each other.
Well, there's a problem for you, Maria, to ponder. Yeah, I think now you've got the last word, because we really need to wind up. We're over time, but Rebecca's question in a way goes to the heart of your presentation, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much for the question, Rebecca. It is definitely something that I need to reflect upon and to better underline and highlight in my dissertations as one of the potential contributions of my work. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. And I would like to give my email. And I'm very impressed by your work, because you have made very detailed in factors and to analyze. Very impressive.
Thank you, Rebecca. We need to close the webinar, unfortunately, Rebecca. We're over time, but thanks for your questions and contribution. So come back again when we resume our webinar program. Maria, I think everyone's interested in your work as a result of this, so it would be good if you could prepare a CG working paper based on your presentation today. I mean, it's like a proto-journal article, really, that sort of lower level of finish and precision, perhaps, but you know, something you can put out there and draw discussion on, and prior to publishing a more polished paper. And it's a format which we've published, I think, 83, and we've got another 5 or 6 in the works. So it's a format we've found very useful for people. And I'll write a letter on that. Colleagues, thank you for your participation today and in previous webinars as well. As I announced earlier on, 177 of them over a 2.25 year period. We won't resume webinars immediately after the August break in the UK. We're going to resume in October, because we've had a change of personnel, with Trevor Trehan unfortunately leaving us, and a new communications director yet to be appointed. So we're going to have a hiatus on the webinars on the normal program in September, but we'll resume again in October. And one of our early topics we think will be research assessment. It's an ongoing issue. Maria, you're working in something which matters to everyone working in higher education, I think, in some way, and certainly all of those involved as active scholars and scientists. So, you know, all power to you, and we look forward to future contributions in our webinars and seeing your work elsewhere. Thanks, colleagues. And from a very cold Australia, not like the Northern Hemisphere at the moment, let me say bye for now and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you so much, everyone.